Pastor Ryan here as we come to the sixth week of the Wesleyan Catechism. We come, and today will be the last day in which we deal with the first of the three sections of the Catechism. We will end or conclude talking about the 10 Commandments. And so last week we talked about the first three commandments of the second table of commandments, the commandments that have to do with how we treat and how we live with one another. And so we'll conclude that second table today by looking at the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th commandments, rather the last three of the 10 commandments and the last three, the second three of that second table. So we'll begin right away with question 13 of the Wesleyan Catechism. What is meant by the 8th commandment? Thou shalt not steal, which we've probably heard and we've known this for many times, but I really love the way that Wesley unpacks that. He unpacks it to think of the idea as theft in a way that is much broader in scope than you and I might originally think. It's not just about taking an item that exists in someone else's possession or that they have ownership of and that we just take it from them. There's much more to theft than that, and that's what he unpacks here. So this is what he says. This command forbids us to rob ourselves of what we have by sinful spending, or of the use and comfort of it by sinful sparing, or to rob our others by invading our neighbor's rights, taking his goods or house or field, forcibly or clandestinely, overreaching in bargains, not restoring what is borrowed or found, withholding just debts, rents, or wages, and which is worst of all, to rob the public in coin or revenue, or that which is dedicated to the service of religion. There's a lot going on in there. But Wesley begins by saying we shouldn't rob ourselves. Oftentimes we think of this, and even as I began to say this, we think of this as taking what is somebody else's. They have ownership of it and we take it. But oftentimes we rob ourselves. Well, how do we rob ourselves? We rob ourselves, he says here, by sinful spending. We fritter money away. We know we fritter time away too. That's a way in which we rob ourselves of our own lives, perhaps. But we take that which we have and we fritter it away. We spend it in ways that are sinful, that are frivolous, that do not do good for ourselves as individuals or for our own families, for those we love, or for our own communities. And so we steal in that way. We steal also by using it, or the comfort by sinful sparing. Well, what is that? Well, if we fritter money away and we spend lavishly on things that don't matter, it's by not spending on what does matter. We spend too sparingly. We are not gracious with our own family members and what their needs are. We're not gracious toward the church in our tithes and our offerings. We're not gracious with those in need around us. We rob God and we rob ourselves and we rob those around us when we sin or when we're sinfully sparing. And then he gets to the component that we talk about, when we rob our neighbor. But he doesn't begin with our neighbor's property, he begins with our neighbor's rights. What is the right of our neighbor? What is it that those around us should be able to reasonably expect from us, and ways in which we live our lives, in which we lift their lives up? We take their goods, their house, their field, those things that we normally think of as stealing. And he says if we do so forcefully or clandestinely, it may be easy for us to say, well, they won't miss it, or they won't know if I take it. And he says, don't do that. He also talks about overreaching in our bargains. Do we take advantage of those who are desperate to sell things? Do we whittle them down? Do we make bargains and agreements with them in ways that are unfair and unjust to them simply for the sake of us paying less? Or do we not restore what is borrowed? We borrow. It's easy for me to think of this because there's books behind me, but how many times do we borrow a book? We borrow a tool from a neighbor and we don't return it. Or we find something that belongs to someone else and we don't return it to the rightful owner. Or perhaps we withhold our just debts. Do we pay those that we owe? We borrow money. Are we of upright and noble character enough to pay that money back, to pay our rents and to pay wages if we owe anyone wages? Or he says this, to rob, worst of all, the public in coin or revenue. Now, I don't think this is because John Wesley was a great patriot, although I don't think he was unpatriotic in any way. But I think what he is getting at here and hinting at is that we must spend and we must use all of the treasures, the talents, and the gifts that God's given us, all of the finances at our fingertips, at our grasp, that we are called to be stewards of, that we use them in such a way that they promote the common good. Do we do that? And most of all, he says, that which is dedicated to the service of religion. Now, remember also that John Wesley is not American. He did not live in a place where there's a separation of church and state. In fact, there was a head of the church, and that was the king, or that was the queen. And Queen Elizabeth is still the head of the church, as far as John Wesley would have been concerned as an Anglican. And so this idea of what was given or dedicated to the service of religion would be much more intertwined in his thought than it may be for us as Americans. So, thou shalt not steal. Perhaps we need to broaden our definition of what it means for us to steal. And then the 14th question is, what is meant by the 9th commandment? The 9th commandment is this. The answer is, thou shalt not bear false witness. This forbids three things in Wesley's thinking. The first is speaking falsely in any matter, lying, equivocating, or in any way devising and designing to deceive our neighbor. So that is that we just don't tell the truth. We falsify things. We lie or we equivocate. We know the answer and we could answer straight in a straightforward manner, but we refuse to. The second is this, speaking unjustly against our neighbor to the prejudice of his reputation or her reputation. In other words, our voice and what we say about those around us could be a way in which we bear false witness. And this is the third thing, bearing false witness against him, laying to his charge things that he knows not, either upon oath, by which the third commandment, the sixth or eighth, as well as this, are broken. Or in common converse, slandering, backbiting, tale-bearing, T-A-L-E, that's false telling tall tales, aggravating what is done amiss, and anyway endeavoring to raise our own reputation upon the ruin of our neighbors, which is the highest offense of both these kinds put together. So when we shall not bear false witness, the question here is also one of, do we lift up? Do we champion? Do we encourage? Do we value the image of God in our neighbor? And in particularly here in this third area or arena which Wesley mentions, do we do so perhaps putting our neighbor down to build ourselves up? That's something we ought not to do. And then question 15, our last question today, what is meant by the 10th commandment? The answer is, thou shalt not covet. The foregoing command implicitly forbid all desire of doing that which will be an injury to our neighbor. This forbids all inordinate desire of having that which will be a gratification to ourselves. And I just want to pause right there. He's going to say more about that in ways in which we probably think about coveting in a regular way. But what is it that we see in the world, and we have an inordinate desire for that thing in the world to be a gratification for ourselves? That could be all manner of things, and my guess is this, that as you listen to this and you're listening with somebody else or you know somebody else, those things which you desire most to use in this world for your own self-gratification are not necessarily those of the person next to you. So this is not about just these blanket statements that we might make, but really these commandments are they're designed for us to examine our own hearts, not just our behavior, but our hearts, our attitude. An inordinate desire is not something that is necessarily manifested in action, but it is something that in the way in which we view our own hearts and utilize our own hearts, thinking about that desire that we have that is not good, and lingering on it in an inordinate way, that we think about the goods of the world in such a way that they should be organized to our own gratification. That's coveting. He goes on and he says, oh, such a man's house were mine, such a man's wife were mine, such a man's estate were mine. This is certainly the language of discontent at our own lot and envy at our neighbors. And these are the sins principally forbidden here. God give us all to see our face in the glass of this law and to lay our hearts under the government of it. Will we see in the Ten Commandments a mirror, a way in which we are called to examine and to look at our own hearts, that we might submit ourselves to the law of God? Amen.